Welcome to Spicer & Company. I'm Sean Spicer.
And I'm Lindsay Keith. Well, the fallout continues from the killing of an unarmed black man while in police custody. The killing was captured on video, and the police officer who used his knee to choke George Floyd to death was arrested earlier today.
Yeah, this wasn't anywhere near a close call. I can't think of a single person who has seen this video that questions what was really going on and whether or not these police officers were acting appropriately. All of this, as you guys have probably seen, has ignited riots in multiple cities across the country. I mean, we've seen violent protests and looting, buildings being burned, and we're going to get to all of that. But protests of a different kind are also happening in Hong Kong as China institutes new laws that restrict the city of Hong Kong. And on Capitol Hill, lawmakers are deciding what can be done to push back on communist China, causing among other things, closing a global pandemic. One of the leaders of that task force is going to be with us to join it. But first, let's get a discussion going on what is happening in Minneapolis. As I mentioned a moment ago, there's been a lot of rioting and loitering around the country. And I want to give you a glimpse of what's happening to put this in perspective in some of these individual cities. Here we are, protesters setting fire to a police station in Minneapolis. The precinct there is the focus of most of the protests over the killing of George Floyd. It was abandoned by staff and police officers before it was burned to the ground by protesters. And more stunning images from Minneapolis. This scene was also outside of a police station showing protesters continuing to set fire to buildings. Now, all of this as more than 500 soldiers from the Minnesota National Guard have been deployed after both the mayors of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and St. Paul requested assistance. And the protests aren't limited to those two cities. I mean, they have spread from coast to coast. In Los Angeles, at least 9 people were arrested after our initial peaceful protest turned very chaotic. And then in Denver, the situation escalated when police and protesters clashed. Going a little bit over to the East Coast, over in Columbus, Ohio, downtown, police and protesters clashed in what initially started off as peaceful protests again. And then in New York City, dozens of people were arrested in Union Square as police officers there were assaulted. So to help break this all down for us, joining us is former New York City Police Commissioner and Newsmax contributor Bernard Kerik and former Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clarke. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, the first thing that I need to understand, and I hope a lot of people share this same concern, is why did it take so long for this officer to be arrested? I've watched enough crime scene, shows. I've seen enough, read enough reports in the news that if you see a crime happen, they stop it, they arrest the guy, and they take him away. Why did it take so long for this to happen? Because I kept hearing that we need to get our ducks in a row. We need to get this all lined up. That's not how I normally see it go down. Commissioner Kerik, why was this different than what would normally happen?
Well, listen, it's not really different than what would normally happen, because when you have a circumstance where officers are authorized by law to use force, you got to make sure that the force they were using and what happened was adequate or within the bounds of the law, if you will. In this case, I saw personally, I've looked at 4 or 5 different videos. You don't know what else was out there. And the one thing they don't want to do is go out and make an arrest without sufficient probable cause, and then they lose that case in court. They want to make sure that everything's in order. They want to make sure they have all the evidence they need to basically prove their case in a court of law. And I think that's what took so long.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. But I also think that when you've got a 9-minute video of a guy putting their knee on someone's neck, asking for help, and he dies, I don't know what more evidence that you need. Sheriff Clarke, let me ask you this. When I grew up, my parents taught me if you get stopped by the police, you obey them, you do everything that you're told, you answer respectfully, and then, you go on. I don't know how, if you're a young black girl or boy, that you can be taught that and not be worried that if you do obey the police, something like this could happen. Are you concerned that based on a lot of events leading up to this, but this one in particular, that this is going to be very hard for a young black girl or boy to look at a police officer and not be very, very scared?
Now, if they're raised right, that's the way my parents raised me, that police officers are authority figures, and you do what they say and you have respect for them, just like you would teachers adults in the neighborhood, and it comes from upbringing. This is an anomaly. Let's be honest. When you look at the data, and I'm not here to defend that officer's actions. He'll have an attorney that does that. But the fact is that he's entitled to due process. The criminal justice system will work its course through this. We shouldn't rush to judgment, and I'm not suggesting you are, Sean, but it's not like it happens on TV where it happens within 30 or 40 minutes. You have to have this thing called probable cause. You have to have a warrant. Look, the prosecutor has to block all of this out because he has to get this right. He only gets one chance. If he screws this up, he's going to lose the case or it'll end up in an acquittal. You look at what Marilyn Mosby did in Baltimore. She rushed to get these warrants out and get these officers arrested, and she got it handed to her in a court of law because she made missteps. The prosecutor has to take his time because he only gets one shot at this. But, one of the other reasons that you make an arrest right away is the threat of escape. The officer's not going anywhere. All right. I don't even know if the medical examiner's report has come back yet. The prosecutor needs that. He needs it to be determined that a homicide was committed here. And it takes time for the postmortem exam. So what I'm trying to say here is there's a lot of moving parts that have to happen. And that's why it's taken so long. Maybe Minnesota uses a grand jury system. They got to convene a grand jury, but that's why this thing it seems to be taking longer than most people think it should.
Yeah, I understand that. I just think there's something very different about this case. Commissioner Kerik, let me ask you, you've dealt with a big city that had issues like this. Is this bad policing? Is it racism? Is it both? I want to know what you think needs to get done in this case.
Well, look, I don't want to prejudge, especially now that this guy's been charged, but I will tell you, when you watch the video and you look at the officer's actions, the other officers that were there as well, you question the tactics. This guy was in handcuffs. He was being detained. He wasn't resisting, that we could see from the video. So, you have to question the tactics, the training, the department in general. This guy had 18 other, civilian complaints. Obviously, somebody's going to have to look at that. But, like the sheriff said, you can't broad brush the entire police service in what goes on in the country. You have 800,000 police officers around the country. You can't judge them based on this one incident.
Well, that's a good point that you make, Commissioner Kerik. But also, is this just an issue of there wasn't enough training and there should be more implemented down the road? Or is there a situation when we need to be bringing more black cops into these police forces to be helping with something? Is that a race issue in that way? What can be done? Sheriff?
Well, the race issue, I don't look at everything through the lens of race. There are agencies that have a lot of black officers, and this stuff still happens. I think Baltimore Police Department is an example with the Freddie Gray case. It wasn't a situation of not having enough minority representation in the agency. But as for the training, when I looked at this, that stood out right away. Is the way we're trained. The way we train is that once you get a guy in custody, once you get him under control, and he had his hands cuffed behind his back, you sit him upright. Why? Because if you put too much pressure on him sometimes, even if you're kneeling on his back and you don't allow his chest to expand and contract, he can die from what's called positional asphyxia. And so we train that, we teach that. And that doesn't mean that from time to time an officer isn't going to go to the dark side and do something that he wasn't trained to do. And that's what the criminal justice system is for. And that will take care of it. I have no doubt that they'll get this right in Minneapolis. And if not, the FBI is looking at civil rights violations. So I'm not going to worry about that right now. As for training, the training is continuous. It goes on and on and on and over and over and over. But that doesn't mean, like I said, sometimes people are going to go outside that and do something that they shouldn't do. So I'm not going to blame the training here. I'm just going to blame the tactics used by the officers. And you had other officers on the scene there. Common sense comes into this. Some of those officers that were standing around could have easily said, moved over and, hey, let the guy sit up, turn him over. Right. But there was no leadership there, no leadership.
Yeah, that's absolutely. I mean, you had not just the other officers, there were people on the sidelines saying he can't breathe. He let him up. Nobody was involved. This whole incident is just so troubling. And I understand all of your points, but this is one where people who maybe aren't in law enforcement see it a little differently, but I just the video speaks for itself. Gentlemen, I appreciate you being here. There's so much more to break down, and I hope we can continue this conversation. Have a great weekend and continue to stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, tensions between Twitter and President Trump are also escalating. This comes as Trump signed an executive order calling for regulation that would limit liability protection for social media companies. That spat between social media giant and the president escalated overnight when Trump tweeted about the riots in Minneapolis, saying this, quote, "I can't stand back and watch this happen to a great American city, Minneapolis. A total lack of leadership. Either the very weak radical left mayor, Jacob Frey, get his act together and bring the city under control, or I will send in the National Guard and get the job done right." He goes on to say, "These thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. Just spoke to Governor Tim Walz and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty, and we will assume control. But when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Thank you," end quote. You know, as you know, Sean, shortly after that, Twitter posted a warning label on Trump's tweet stating that it violated their platform rules about glorifying violence. And then, of course, Trump slammed back and said, Twitter has this double standard. What's your take on all this? Did he cross the line there or not? Was this a misstep for Twitter?
I mean, the only thing I take issue with is frankly the fact that the mayor had called for the National Guard, and the mayor, you know, both cities have called for it. They don't have any control. This is a governor's call. But I don't believe this was glorifying. It was actually saying, I don't want to see anything happen in the city of Minneapolis, and I'm willing to take any steps. The president put the DOJ and the FBI in there right away yesterday, and that showed a lot. I think Twitter has gotten way too reactionary, and this was kind of silly.
Yeah, it was silly. And this feels like a spat back and forth right at this point.
Exactly. All right. Well, we mentioned this yesterday, but I am very excited to tell you that President Trump's going to be our special guest next week. We're going to pull back the curtain on what life for him has been like as president, living in the White House, how it's changed him. A little bit more of the personal side of this. So we're going to talk to him about all of that. And then obviously we've already talked to you about the series next week. And so we're going to talk to him about the battle with liberals who run social media companies and their clear bias against conservatives. It's all part of what we've told you before is this week-long series called Blocked and Banned, Social Media Censorship of the Right. Of course, the president's the highlight of the whole week, but we're going to hear from a ton of great guests. Constitutional law expert Alan Dershowitz, Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, conservative talk show host Dave Rubin, FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, tons of conservative voices who've been silenced by big tech, and so many more. And by the way, all this kicks off Monday with Donald Trump Jr., as we told you. Set your DVR right now.
It's going to be great. Well, coming up in our show today, we're bringing in Congressman Denver Riggleman to give us an update on the China task force. And later, as Communist China continues to pose a threat to our national security and we get closer to the November election, is Biden's relationship with Beijing impacting his presidential campaign? We've got all that and more when we return.